Hi, this is Kate Elliott, your host for Narrative Worlds, a monthly podcast hosted on the SFWA Nebula Conference platform, in which I talk with another writer about world building, narrative, and anything about craft we want to talk about. This week, my fabulous guest is Ann Leckie, who is, I wrote this down, she's the author of the Hugo, Nebula, and Locus award-winning novel Ancillary Justice and the rest of the Imperial Roch series. She's also written the novel Provenance and her fantasy debut, The Raven Tower, as well as short fiction, and I'm sure other things that we may never know about. So welcome, Ann.
Thank you.
Yeah. So I kind of dumped this title on you, which I made up, called Using Character Interactions to Seamlessly Build Worlds and Narratives Without Infodump. And I made that up because you are someone who I think spends a lot of time on social interaction and relationships between people to give me a sense of what is going on in your world without telling me the diplomat had to bow to the king first. You just, it happens. And slowly through accretion, I begin to understand more and more through me watching the characters interact. And I was actually going to ask you, what is world building to you? But let's come back to that later. Can you talk to me more about what world building is to you and why you do it? You have a light touch, and yet it's very in-depth. And it's that contrast between that seemingly light touch and yet that in-depth feeling I get as a reader that I know this place. Can you talk about how that developed or how you approach world building?
So I do a lot of offstage world building that never ends up on the page. But part of that's because I feel like characters can't be who they are without a world to surround them to make them who they are, right? Because all of us, I mean, we are who we are, and I'm not sure if we were raised in different places, if we would be completely different people. I mean, maybe we would be, but a lot of the ways that we react to things and the assumptions that we make, they have a lot to do with the world that we live in, the social world that we live in. And so if I'm building a character and I want them to be impetuous, that impetuous doesn't exist in a vacuum, right? That impetuous is going to exist in a situation where, a social situation where people, and this is another thing, people say impetuosity is frowned upon, but actually certain kinds aren't, or impetuosity is not valued socially, and people who are going to be impetuous have to find a way to get around that. All of those things are going to shape who this person is. And so, I mean, I do the infodump thing, right?
Yeah,
I love a good infodump as much as the next girl, right? I mean, that's what we're here for, right? We're here for the amazing worlds, but yeah, to a large extent, world building is part of my character building, but also it's just fun, right? Which is, I think, why I do so much of it. It's just fun, and one of the things that makes it work best, I find, as a reader, and then it's something I use as a writer, is not to think of cultures as flat, right? It's not like, well, in this culture, they don't value impetuosity. Is that a word? I think it's a word. I'm a writer.
It is a word. It's a
now.
word. I proclaim it a word.
Okay. It's never like a culture, a city, a religious group, an ethnic group, whatever, will tell a story about itself. We don't like people to be impetuous, but there's always a place where there's an except when, or, well, that's not really impetuous, that's different, that's a special situation. Those things always exist. And one of the things when I'm world building is I always try and look for those things and put them in, because it suddenly makes it three-dimensional, right? And it makes your characters more three-dimensional too, because you know, you look at somebody from another culture and you go, well, they're Lower Slavovian, and Lower Slavovians always get drunk on Wednesdays. Always. And because they have a firm cultural and religious belief that they have to. And you're like, well, that's maybe even a story Lower Slavovians tell about themselves. But if you talk to an individual Lower Slavovian, you'll find that there's a lot more nuance. And so when you're writing the story about your Lower Slavovian, you want to stop and think, okay, but where's the exception? What are the nuances here? Because otherwise what you've got is this flat sort of stereotype character, and your world building seems flat and your character seems flat. So I'm always looking for the places where cultures contradict themselves, because they're always there. They're always there. Or the places where you're oversimplifying when you describe a culture, because there's always exceptions. There's always way more nuance and detail past that.
You know, it's really interesting, because one of the things that I've thought about for a long time is this idea that we can write a secondary world as like we're tourists looking at it, in which all the people who live in that world are other people, but they're not us. Or we can write the world and try to remove ourselves just as much as we ever can, which we can never, and write the world from their perspective.
Right.
And that's what, when you say that about society, people, we all exist in a social sphere. Mm-hmm. That's as true for people in a fantasy world as for us. And I guess when I think about the occasional tendency of monocultures, of that SFNF thing of monocultures, like you said, they all get drunk on Wednesday. That's a way of looking, but you don't look at the US. I mean, some people do. And in fact, it's a problem in the US when people look at and say we should be this one thing, but we've never been this one thing.
Right. Well, and I think people outside the US probably do, because why wouldn't they, right? And say, oh, although they're all gun-toting, beer-drinking cowboys or whatever, you know. This was years and years ago. This is totally off the, I was traveling. I was just out of college and I was in Ireland, and somebody had said to me, oh, you're from the US, cowboys and Indians. And I was like, I'm not even from that part of the US.
Yeah.
Like, you have no idea.
Yeah. Yeah. And that's actually, I think, for people in any culture, as they're writing, whether, I mean, it's easy for me to say Americans because I'm American, but it's to think about, as they're writing and as they're developing the world, is to think about how even is the culture around me have all these subsets. I mean, I grew up in an immigrant household. My mother is an immigrant. My father's grandparents were immigrants from the same culture. I talk about this all the time. And it gave me this like bifurcated view. I was like a half step outside the main culture. And I think it prepared me for being a science fiction fantasy writer.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. It's, you know, if I think if a person is totally embedded in the mainstream, it can be harder to find that space in science fiction fantasy world building of saying this can be more complex.
It can be harder, but I don't think it's impossible, because I think even the mainstream group is more varied and complicated and nuanced than the stories the mainstream group tells about itself, right? There's always the stories that a culture tells about itself, you know. You know, men keep a stiff upper lip, whatever it is, you know, and it's always more complicated than that. But it does help to have experience of all the different groups so that you can see, no, in fact, the city that you live in is not made up of people who are all just like you. Or the people who are outside your group are not all the flat, oh, they're all shoplifters, or oh, they're all hairdressers, or oh, they're all, you know, whatever it is it's not like that. I mean, that's important. I think it's important in life generally.
Yeah,
but it's a huge, huge help in writing. I also think this is where being able to control POV, because you had mentioned that earlier also, being able to control POV is extremely important, because using POV, you can manipulate what information is getting to the reader and how, and maybe not even in an obvious way, but that's part of how you get writing as that person or from that person's point of view, really, and not yourself looking at the person like a tourist.
Tell me more. Tell me more.
It's hard. That's difficult for me to articulate. There are a lot of writing theory things that I don't articulate very much. And I talk about them very theoretically, which I know maybe isn't helpful. But if
I have, oh, I'm sorry, go ahead.
Once you got a handle on POV, for instance, okay, I guess I'll start on one of my pet peeves.
Yeah.
Occasionally I'll hear somebody say that first person's not good to write in for all these various reasons. I've heard somebody say that editors won't buy it. Don't even get me started on that one. But the one that tells me when somebody says this, I know they don't really know how to handle certain things about POV, is first person is difficult because you can't say anything about the other characters. You're only ever talking about the narrating character. So it's hard to get any other characters across. And
yeah,
that's just not true.
It's just not true.
But it does, thinking about it now, it does suggest that there's like a skill level thing there that, because kind of obviously, you can show us, once you show us your main character's character, your narrator, the way they react to other people tells you so much about those other people. But you have to have that baseline to begin with, and you have to be aware of doing that to begin with. And I think that's where thinking about the subtleties of culture and the subtleties of character, thinking of them not as simple flat cutouts, but as complicated, nuanced entities, really helps you with that. Because once you're thinking of your main character that way, then you're thinking about your other characters that way, and then those interactions can have more life to them, if that makes sense.
It does. And one of the other things I wonder sometimes, I don't know, that if perhaps for some people, maybe beginning writers or other writers, I don't know, that first person, just to use that example, can sometimes seem like everything has to be about them, like all the mirrors, you know, focus on them. But in fact, we can learn so much, as you said, about a character and a world because of how they react to different people they meet with, how those people react to them. And then my favorite, which just took me so long to figure out, which is that they notice different things than I do. And I need to know what they notice. So I had a character who sewed a lot and was really interested in clothing. Well, I don't sew. My cousin did. So I watched her and her mom sew when I was a kid. I don't sew. And I'm like, you know, I wear my Title IX sweater. Isn't this nice? It's a nice color. Anyway, but so I realized that she would notice all these things I wouldn't notice. And then that immediately gave me a window into parts of the world that suddenly were important to her. And that gave me a fresh way of looking at the world.
Right. That's super important. That's the thing I've seen. This has been ages too, doing critiques of, I'm going to say beginning writers, but I mean, folks at the beginning of their writing journey who doubtless by now have become much better, who, you know, you write a story where somebody is preternaturally attuned to the gesture someone makes with their hands, but you never see anybody's hands described. Or, you know, little things like that. And paying attention to those things really brings out a lot of stuff. And once you start noticing those things, it brings a lot of things out. And as you say, it gives you another way to look at things. Yeah, the other, you know, there's a first person trick where you write a story in the first person and it's very clear that the narrator has no idea what's actually going on.
Yeah.
Those are great. Those are fabulous. It actually, it's probably for folks who like writing exercises. I am not a fan of writing exercises, but not because I think badly of them, just because they frustrate me. but if you're a fan of a writing exercise and you are looking for something like that, writing that kind of story, or trying to, is probably a really good way to start finding your way into that kind of first person.
And actually that's true of any point of view. I wrote one of the, it's a novelette that I'm most proud of. I don't write a lot of short fiction. Is a novelette called Bloom, which is set in my Cold Magic / Spirit Walker universe. And it's in the Gardner Dozois Book of Magic, but it's told from the third person point of view of a man in his 50s who is, when I first conceived of the story, I didn't like him, and he was going to be an unpleasant character, and I was going to use the story to kind of criticize him. But once I started writing it, I began to feel sympathy for this man who I came to see as I was writing it, had grown up very repressed, had then been moved as a teenager to a place where he didn't know anyone. And so he's shy and, very reserved, maybe has a little social anxiety or a lot, doesn't know how to function. And now he's an older man, and that all this. So, but for me, so I became, and then he had lost someone dear to him that he had never known how to grieve for. So this all happens. But what I realized when I got to the end of the story is that the reader can totally understand the things going on around him, even though he doesn't. Mm-hmm. And I was proud of myself. I finished that and I thought, wow, look at this. Readers are reading a different story than he is seeing. And I think it's the first time I've done it so clearly. And I wrote that, 25 years into my career.
Yeah, well, those are not easy. They are not easy. They're great. I don't think I've ever done one, honestly. I've done things where the reader knows things are happening that the narrator doesn't, but I've never sustained it for like a whole piece.
Well, I mean, this was for me. For me, a novelette is like flash fiction for anyone else.
Yeah, I have to admit, when I really liked your story in the Book of Dragons, by the way.
Thank you.
When you were mentioning that, I was like, oh, I remember reading that, and I really like that. When I'm asked to write a short story, it almost always, without my meaning to, it comes out at about 12,000 words.
Yes.
That's like my default length. Yeah. And but nobody wants 12,000 words. I shouldn't say nobody. That's not true. It's not true that nobody wants them. Please don't let me discourage people from writing 12,000 word stories. It's a lovely length. But very often somebody will say, can we have a story? And they'll be like, no longer than 7,000 words. And I'll be like, oh, really?
How do you do that? I know people who can do it, and I'm just in awe of them.
I've done it. I actually made myself, this was very early in my short fiction career, which was brief and unglorious. I actually forced myself to write a story 300 words long. Wow. And I sold it. And I was like, all right, check that off on the list. Right. But I had just sort of worked my way down. But really, if I'm left to so I can if I have to, but if I'm left to myself, it's going to be 12,000 words, or it's going to be 100,000 words.
I didn't realize that was the case for me until I wrote some things, and they all came in between 12 and 14.
Yep.
And I'm like, why? But this was a short story. I was so sure it would fit in 6,000.
Except all the world building stuff. So that's the thing that I admire about folks who write short fiction, like we're talking, 4 to 7,000 words, and make these beautiful little worlds. Because for me, even though I'm not doing a lot of info dumps, part of the beauty of the story for me is that world building. And there's all these things that I want to put in there just because they're beautiful. Yep. But you can't do that at those short lengths. And I think that's part of why I end up at 12,000 words, because I'm like, oh, but this is cool. I can't leave it out.
That is absolutely, that's the same for me, because for me, the world is a character.
Right. And an important character, right? Yeah. Because as I said, none of the things that happen in the story would happen without the world.
Yeah, and that's actually one of those situations where, and I think I can wind this into me having recently read The Raven Tower, but this is one of those situations where, for me as a writer, I can't just come up with a plot and then plop it down anywhere, because the plot has to function within the world as well.
Yep. Absolutely. That's and sometimes I'll have a plot that doesn't have or it's not really a plot. It's that sign of kind of,
Yeah.
you know what I mean?
Yeah. An
That,
emotional conflict or something. Right?
yeah.
A
And I'll be
thing.
like, I need a world to put it in because I can't go any further with this. And sometimes they'll just hang there for a long time until I find the world to put it in, which is part of, it's kind of nice to have, you probably, it's nice to have established universes.
Yeah.
And then you have a thing and you're like, well, could it fit somewhere in one of my established universes? Because then I don't got to do all that foundation building.
Yeah,
It's already
yeah.
there. And I
Yeah.
can, I can tack it in, and how would it fit? And that's actually very helpful. Once again, I have the hugest amount of admiration for the folks who it's a totally different universe every book they write.
I can't do that.
That is so much work, and it's so lovely. And I'm like, it's not. That's kind of how I feel about outlining too. Like people who outline, they're magic. I don't know how they do it. Right? It's wonderful.
Yeah,
do you outline?
You mean the story or the? I do
The story.
I do a mixed.
Okay.
I'm mixed. I have to know where my end point is. I have.
Yes.
And I have to know, and I always know some of the main points along the way.
Mm-hmm.
And then I'm like a discovery writer. I don't always know how they link up. And then linking them up sometimes will alter that main point so it doesn't look the way I originally thought it would, but it's still the same thing. Mm-hmm. There's a scene in Cold Fire, the second Spirit Walker book, where I knew there was going to be a scene between the hero and the heroine on a bench. And I originally had thought in my mind through the whole scene in a sense, but it ended up in a totally different place, in a totally different point in the story. But it was still that scene on the bench. And that was, I don't know. So who knows why that was so crucial?
Well, there was some kind of emotional load or something about that.
Oh, it's a heavy
that moment. Yeah.
Yeah, it's a heavy emotional scene. But it ended up there because of other things that happened. And that's how. So yeah, and then I'll outline as I go. Like I'll get to a certain point and I'll say, okay, I know what the next 2 chapters need to do in order to get me to. So it's this kind of up and down discovery. Like it's a wilderness, and there's certain landmarks that I need to get to, and then I have to figure out how I'm going to go get to the next place.
Yeah. Well,
how do you do that?
It's very much the same, actually. Okay. I know the basic sort of the shadow of what's happening. I have to know where I'm ending up. I know some of the big moments along the way, some set pieces, some emotionally fraught moments. And then I work my way from one to the other, right? Like, I know I need to get to that hill over there. And so it's really very similar. I can't start until I know the end. I know folks who do amazing work, who they sit down and write a chapter by chapter outline.
I know.
In this chapter, the hero will discover the talking sword. In this chapter, the talking sword will run away. In this chapter, and I'm like, how do you even know what happens in that chapter until you've written the chapter before?
I once went, years and years ago, I went to a talk by Kate Wilhelm, right, where Late the Sweet Birds Sang. And she said she gardened her books. She gardened a lot. Mm-hmm. And while she was gardening, over the course of probably weeks or perhaps months, she would create the entire story in her head, such that when she was done, all she had to do was sit down, and it was like taking dictation.
It's magic. I think John Scalzi does something similar. I think he said he plays video games and works out, and then just sits down and writes, and can write fairly quickly doing that.
I wish, man.
I know, right? But writing is very much, the sun is coming in. Sorry, it's very sunny today. Writing, I'm convinced that writing is something that the back of your brain does so much of the work. Not all of it, but a lot of it. A lot of the tricks to writing are questions of how do you trick the back of your brain into producing the results that you want, which means everybody's techniques are going to be very individual.
Yeah.
I mean, they're going to fall into certain groups. It's going to bell curve. That's just how people are. But a trick that works for one person might not necessarily work for someone else, right? And so it's important to figure out which ones work for you. And if only video games all day would work for me, that would be wonderful.
Yeah, I'm a movement person. I have to be for me, going for a walk will shake things loose.
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
A lot of times when I'm stuck and I'll be sitting at the desk and going, oh God, I can't get up until I get some words. And then finally I give up and go to take a shower. And it's the minute I get up from the desk and start walking that my brain will go, that's the solution to the problem. And I'm like, I should have gotten up 2 hours ago.
Yeah. But we keep repeating those bad patterns, right?
Yeah.
It's like, this time it'll be different. The other thing about that is, and I think the thing I've learned the hard way, and I still struggle with, is that sometimes I just have to wait.
Yeah.
Sometimes it's not yet. It's taking a while. I finished in July, I finished a draft, a complete draft, which of the second Sun book. And it wasn't really, the truth is it was complete. And the first half had been revised like 5 times before I had to do it. It was the weirdest process thing. Normally I'll write a complete draft and then with maybe at 3/4, I might stop, go back through once and go to the end. But this one I had to do multiples. I had to keep going back and redoing.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah, it was, yeah, it sucked. But that's how it wanted to be written. But I reached this point and I only had 8 chapters left. I knew what had to be in them. And my brain just said, done, you're done for now. And so I sent it to my editor and I said, here it is. Here's a complete draft. I didn't say I did say the last 8 chapters are all there. They're just in outline form. And then I did something else for 2 months. And during that time, everything settled in. And then I knew exactly how to do it.
Yep.
I just needed it. And it would have done me no good to sit for 2 months staring at that screen.
Right. In fact, it might have done harm. It might have done harm.
Yeah.
I remember telling this to students that I've had and to other folks, other writers who are having a rough time, which is the work isn't always writing.
Yeah.
Sometimes the work is getting up and going for a walk. And sometimes the work is taking a nap. And sometimes the work is sitting on your couch and reading whatever novels seem most appealing to you. One of my things that I like to do when I'm stuck, although I haven't been able to do it this past year or two, when I'm stuck, is to go to a university library, which the place where I am is blessed with several, and just walk up and down the history or anthropology shelves.
Yes.
And whatever calls to me, like I'll see a title and I'd be like, oh, that looks really cool. I have no idea how, and 9 times out of 10, one of those books has something in it that after I've been reading for a while, will be like, oh, that's exactly the detail I needed. Now I can get back to work.
That's amazing because it's the same for me. It's like sometimes that serendipity or whatever is out there. It's trying to pull together, and I'll say, oh, I want to buy that book.
Yep.
And then I'll get it and it'll be like the answer I needed.
Yep. And that's, so I'm a big believer in, you trust your subconscious, right? Trust the process and trust the back of your brain. And if the back of your brain is telling you no words are coming, then maybe the back of your brain is telling you need to get some exercise, or you need to go out and see some friends, or you need to go to the library and choose whatever books seem interesting to you. And I just said, I sometimes I don't listen. Like I sit at the desk for 2 hours with no words when my brain is telling me that that's not working. And
it's that Puritan thing. I don't know.
Well, I think it is. This genre has a history of being, and I, to a large extent, approve of this, of being very practical and commercial. Being, okay, so you get your word count, you're writing to sell, you're writing to please readers, you're writing to make money, well, to the extent that you can make money writing, but you know what I mean.
I know.
And so this is a job. And so I'm not thinking about it in terms of, well, I'm inspired today, right? I'm thinking in terms of, I have a job to do and I'm going to sit down and I'm going to put out the words. And there's a lot of advantages to that, but the disadvantage is when the words aren't coming, instead of saying, oh, it's not going to come today. You say, but I have to do my job, right?
Yeah.
But I'm a
Yeah.
failure if I don't do my job. And that's not how it works. It needs to be a more balanced process.
Creativity is hard work.
Yes, it is. Yes,
And
it is.
it's not like lazing around. It's just interesting how they're, I feel it's hard. Like coming out of a session, a really productive session of writing, I'll just be flattened mentally
Mhm.
because even when it was rolling smoothly, and I think that maybe not enough is said about how much work it is.
Yeah, I would agree. I think so. And it's not, it's
It's
valorized in our society, but only in a certain way. And
right.
it's not considered work. It's not considered hard work. And to a certain extent, okay, it's not digging ditches. It's absolutely not
Right.
digging
It's
ditches.
not working in the factory line. I mean, there's a lot of work that is physically grueling and mentally taxing
And it's not that.
And it's not that. Yeah.
But it is definitely work, and it is definitely tiring. And sometimes you just need to give yourself a break. And sometimes the break is what you need to do the work, which is the other.
Yeah.
I mean, on the factory, it's also true. You have to, and this is a thing that perhaps some factory owners and bosses might do well to consider,
Yeah.
which is that you'll get more work out of your folks if you let them get enough rest in between, and if you treat them decently. And it's the same for your creative mind. You'll get more work out of it if you let your mind rest, and if you give yourself the best conditions to create it that you can. I mean, obviously, we can't all have our private island with waiters bringing us our pina coladas and notebooks and things. Boy, wouldn't that be great?
Oh man, now I'm crying.
Yeah.
Oh wait, but I do live on Oahu.
You live
so
in Hawaii,
that's
so you're close enough to that.
Closer, yeah.
I'm in St. Louis, and we're headed into winter. There's no pina coladas here. I mean, there are pina coladas, but but you can't necessarily have the ideal situation, and different people's situations will be different. But give yourself as many breaks as possible, because that's how you will get the most work out of yourself.
One thing I have learned over the years, and I have written consistently I mean, I've been publishing since 1988. Although it was the tail end of 1988, I just want to say that makes me feel like marginally, like 1 minute
marginally younger.
1 minute younger, yeah. But well, actually, and look at how I'm even dismissing age, right? So I'm still caught up in that age thing,
Yeah.
If you get older, you're not meant to, you're supposed to like say, oh, young, but actually
age is an advantage.
Age is an advantage. Yeah.
I mean, there are a lot of fabulous chronologically young writers out there. It's vexed when you say young writer, because you might mean somebody who's beginning to seriously write, and you might mean
right at whatever age, yeah,
20. There are a lot of fabulous chronologically young writers out there, but there's something about the more life experience you have, and the more times you've had to mess up and put it back in a drawer and think about it. I think that's an advantage.
I think that I've thought a lot about this over the last few years, because the debut culture now is very different than when I broke in. When I broke in, a debut novel was just the first lowest rung of the ladder. It was something that kind of, and the expectation was if things went well, you would get 3, 4, 5 novels in before your career inexorably tanked, right, or whatever, unless you broke out, right? But it was just considered the beginning, as opposed to the wedding, right? It's the wedding, it's my big moment, and then the rest will be downhill from here. But so I've thought about that, and I wish we talked more. And so I try to talk a lot about the idea of art and creativity as a lifelong journey. What I can't write what I wrote at 21 anymore. I can't write it. And I wouldn't want to, but I also kind of miss, it's not that I miss that, it's that it was important too, right?
Yes.
It was just as important as to what I'm writing now, and everything in between. So every stage of the journey to me is a crucial one, whenever you start on that journey as a writer. If you don't write your first short story till you're 50, that's fantastic. You're going to bring everything. And if you write it at 16, that's also fantastic too. I like to concentrate on this idea of an entire journey.
Yes. I absolutely agree. And we don't necessarily think in those terms, do we? And there's a lot of, 30 under 30 or whatever, like, oh, what if I'm too old?
Yeah.
Like, it doesn't work that way. And especially, I guess if you have the right circumstances where somebody can support you in your 20s writing, or where if you're fortunate enough to have your work hit right out the gate and you can support yourself, you can dedicate the time it takes. But for a lot of us, it takes a while before we can even start, right? Life has things that happen, or we're not financially settled enough, or we have, family to take. A lot of us have kids to take care of, right?
Right. And there's and then all the other barriers along all the other, marginalities, right? That all the other barriers to entry there can be
Right.
that people have. And it takes different amounts of time for people. And of course, unfortunately, some people never are able to find an opening, which
Some
is
people
to
are
me
never
a
able.
tragedy that we don't get to see and hear people's voices.
Yeah.
But so anytime people can come through is the time that I think it's important to welcome them.
Mhm.
Sorry, there's a squirrel outside. There's no squirrels on a walk.
Oh,
Oh my God, 2 squirrels. Okay, anyway, I'm done.
okay.
So actually we have strayed far, which is
We
fine.
have, I'm sorry.
No, don't apologize, because this is important, I think, for people also to hear, that validation that, yeah, you don't have to work 10 hours a day. Yeah, you don't have to, you can get up, if
you're
you're
tired,
not,
you can take a nap.
yeah, and if you're not on the New York Times bestseller list at 22, it's okay.
It's okay if you're never on the New York Times
Exactly,
bestseller list.
exactly.
It's okay if you're never on awards list. That's a cause of a lot of anxiety for folks.
Oh
I know.
yeah.
So many people never hit those lists and have had amazing careers and people who love their work. And yeah, I'm straying back into the same territory.
No, yeah. I just actually, I'll add one thing. They have, as you say, have had amazing careers, and we never know, any of us, that maybe something we wrote saved someone's life or was important to them to get through a difficult time, or we just don't know.
That's exactly right. That's been one of the big surprises of having a lot of people read my work, is hearing from people who say, this was important to me for whatever reason. And I have enough readers that I hear about it every now and then, but I firmly believe that there are way more people out there, and that, like you say, you never know if stuff is out there and you're never going to run into that person, but you help somebody through a difficult time. You help somebody through a terrible grief. You may even have saved someone's life. You may never know, but I firmly believe that there are a lot of those folks out there, and that's one of many of the important things that telling stories does.
Absolutely. I just have to tell this story quickly. Many years ago, when I wrote The Golden Key with Melanie Ron and Jennifer Robertson, we did a small tour. I think it was the first book tour I'd ever been on. And it was on the strength of them, because they were like big names. But at this tiny independent bookstore I don't know, it was like on some coastal town in California. I don't know. I don't even remember. There we were on our table with the 3 things, and the door opened, and this woman came in with this bottle of wine, and she went up to Jennifer and she said, I can hardly tell this story without choking up. She said, I just need to thank you so much. She said, so this was in the 90s. She says, my husband is a Vietnam War veteran, and one day he went into the bedroom, closed the door, and didn't come out for 2 years. And your Chase Sully, I know, right? And your Chase Sully series got me through those 2 years.
Oh my goodness.
And I was just like, we're all like crying, right? It's humbling.
Yeah, it is. And you rarely hear about it.
I've had a few of those moments, and I just,
it's a big gift. It's a huge gift as a writer when you hear about it, but have confidence that they're probably out there.
Yeah, someone is out there who needed that story just then. And you may never know.
Yeah.
So I actually want to ask this question about the Raven Tower, which I loved, and I
Oh, thank
also
you.
thought was just so well done and just so magnificently structured. But the entire premise of that story is relationships. That's everything, everything. And understanding the world is literally built on the slowly created relationships that you as the reader come to understand through the narrator. Because the narrator is speaking second person to
Right.
the character who we come to know as Iolo. Someone in that world pronounces it like that.
Yes.
But then also the narrator's understanding of their own place in the world, and then how they relate to the world, which because their own understanding changes
Right.
as the story. And I wanted to ask, I mean, when you thought about, I don't even know how to ask or even how to, I mean, I don't have to answer it, but in a way, did you deliberately decide to create your world building through this second person plus first person? It's a combination, right? That world is built through relationships. Did you do that deliberately, and or is it just how it happened? And then how did it happen? How did you come to figure out how to, because that world is so clear in my mind, but you never state much. It's just all done to how the characters relate to the narrator.
Okay. So I didn't start out saying I'm going to build this world through relationships. I started out saying, oh, here's 3 stories that I feel like fit together.
Okay.
3 existing sources. One of them is probably obvious. What plot I stole. And how does it fit into that? Because that was an existing universe that I had from short fiction. I sold a lot more fantasy short fiction than I did science fiction. And a lot of my short fiction readers were surprised when I came out with a science fiction novel and it had been waiting for me to write a fantasy novel. And I said, okay, so I'm going to put this in this existing universe. And then I said, oh, do you know what? Second person's really cool. I was just reminded about how cool second person was by Nora Jemisin, right?
Yeah.
Nora reminds me just how amazing second person is. And I want to play with that toy. And once I decided that the narrator was going to be a god, that forced my hand in a number of places because as you know, because you've recently read the book, gods can't lie.
Right.
And so the narrator has to be extremely careful about what it says. And so half of what it says are somebody told me once, or I heard a story, or maybe this is true, I don't know, because they can't say straight out. And so that kind of forced me to imply a lot of stuff that I otherwise would maybe have just said straight out.
Okay.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does.
And once I was given that constraint, that became a lot of fun. Like, I'm like, well, I can really enjoy that because I could have my narrator say, I heard this story, and now I'm going to tell the story to you the way I heard it. And it could be anything, but I have to be very careful. And also the narrator is also deliberately holding things back.
Yeah.
Right. The narrator's telling the story, but is deliberately sort of lying by omission about a lot of what's going on. And so, which one doesn't realize until almost the end of the book. And so those are constraints that force me to do things. As far as I've always believed that stories generally, I mean, you can tell stories that aren't about relationships, but by and large, stories are about relationships. That's really what they're about. And the relationship might be, between a fish and a rock. But by and large, the relationships that we're interested in reading are relationships between people of one sort or another, whether that rock is a person or, the swarm of mosquitoes is a person.
exactly. It's so brilliant. I'm sorry. It's so good.
When I thought of that, I was like, oh, I've got to do that. Right.
It's so good.
And then I have to be fond of mosquitoes. I'm not, but I still think fondly of the mosquitoes sometimes. And so that point of view and that structure forced me to focus on particular kinds of things. And actually, I think that's something that that goes into the choice of things like POV and structure that maybe we don't always talk about, which is sometimes, you know, we talk about you pick things because they're efficient. Yeah. Right. Or because they do the job you need them to do. And that's, I mean, that's true as far as it goes. But I mean, we could have a 3 or 4 hour discussion about what efficient even means. But sometimes the best reason to choose a thing is because you think it's cool. Yeah. And then you're dealing with the fallout from that choice. So if you say, I want to write a story in second person, narrated by a rock. Well, you don't then say, well, that wouldn't work. It wouldn't be efficient, or that wouldn't, an editor's not interested in that. Don't even worry about what editors are interested in. They don't even know. Yeah. Editors don't know what they want until you show it to them. Exactly. But if your response when you go, okay, second person narrated by a rock, if your response is, wow, that would be really cool, that's your right choice. And if your response is, wow, and that would be hard too. That's an even better choice. Right. That's when you're, yeah. And then, because what are you going to do? Break your leg? Right? It's not like skiing where you'd actually hurt yourself. So just jump into it. And but those choices force a lot of things, or they force you to figure out ways of dealing with the things that those choices set up. And so sometimes starting with a really technical beginning, like, you know, I'm going to write in second person. I'm going to write in first person plural. I'm going to write in Omni and all passive voice. I don't recommend that, but whatever. But someone can make it work, right? Someone is going to hear that and go, oh, I want to do that. Yeah. And you should do that and make it work, because you totally can. Yeah. And that sense of challenge, and also the use of constraints, as opposed to that, constraints can be so liberating, and they can actually like bring you up a level. To, you know, to say, I'm not going to allow myself to do X. So now what do I have to do? Now what's going to happen with it? How am I going to solve that problem? Gods can't lie. So now I have to use that, and that creates this whole set of things that you're doing in the Raven Tower, where as you say, there's the narrator's talking around things. Right. You know, but it has to talk around things in a way that the story will make sense to the reader. Right. Yeah. And then in the end, you do understand what the narrator was saying. And that can be so much fun. Don't make your constraints be editors want this. Yes. Yeah. Oh, I so agree. Don't do that. I mean, unless there's a time and a place. If you see in the list of things editors want, and you go, oh, I want to do that, then do that. Right. But yeah, don't make the constraint is like an exercise, kind of, only in the sense that it, like a sonnet, right? A sonnet has constraints. Well, and my problem with exercises, right, is that I don't, and this is me, this is not, I mean, other folks have a different relationship with them. If I'm going to sit down and write a thing, I'm going to write a thing to send out. Yeah. An exercise, what is an exercise? It's like, you know, when you knit, do you knit or crochet? I don't. I don't do swatches. I freaking hate swatches. And you have to do a swatch. You have to, because you do. And so, because otherwise your sweater comes out all the wrong size and shape, because you didn't figure out exactly what your stitches per inch were. And I hate swatches. What's the point of a swatch? It wastes yarn, it wastes time. I just want to make the sweater, right? That's how I feel about writing exercises. Yeah. And I guess what I meant was, because I agree with you, I never do them because I don't have enough time. But I was thinking in the sense that intellectually you could think,
I'm going to focus on this one thing. I'm going to do second person with a narrator who can't lie, but who can't tell you everything.
Right.
And that's like, I love constraints. The same way I also love saying I can do anything. Right.
Yes. Yes.
Yeah. So the book the book that is now complete, because I took those 2 months to let it percolate, that final bit, does point of view stuff I've never thought was even allowed. I have
everything's allowed. Oh,
everything is allowed. I have.
It's not in an arc yet, right? But I'm going to get an arc, right?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. I'll get you one. It's really long, so I'm just warning you right now. Strangely, for me, it's really long, but it has first person present tense. It has third person past tense, third person present tense, omniscient present tense. That's based on interludes with people who you only see that one time and then never. I mean, it's just, and I just, at one point I thought, I can't do this, and yet here I am doing it. Well, and then I thought, here I am doing it because I need it. Now, maybe you could write this. This is what I thought a lot about while writing Furious Heaven, which is the Second Son book. I thought a lot about this. I could write this a different way, but I don't want to.
Right.
I want to write it this way. Will people say this was the wrong way to write it?
Oh, sure. Somebody will.
Sure. But
somebody always does.
But I'm going to be, the evidence suggests I'm going to be dead someday, right?
Right.
That's right. So fuck it.
Right.
I'm going to write it the way I want to write it.
Mm-hmm.
And I realize that there can be other constraints in terms of, what people need to do maybe to make money, but I don't know.
Yeah, well, and that's a real thing, right? That is absolutely a real thing. The things that are going to be more likely to make money. The thing is that nobody knows what those things are.
Exactly. And I think people's passions tend to.
It goes down on the page. It goes down on the page.
It goes on the page.
Mm-hmm. When you're really into what you're writing, it will go down on the page and make your work more compelling. There must be, I'm very much a materialist, just personally. And there has to be, I feel like, some logical explanation, like on the word level, for why that happens. But it does happen. I've seen it happen so many times. Like, this isn't a thing I'm interested in. I don't know anything about sailing, and I don't really care about sailing. And then I finish a book by somebody who's really into it, really passionate about it. I'm like, I love sailing now. I know everything about sailing. There's something on the word level that goes down on the page when you're really passionate about what you're writing.
Yeah.
Which isn't to say, I mean, not every book has to be that book that rips your heart out of you when you're writing it. And not every book has to be the book that changes your life when you read it. But when you're writing that thing, you should write the thing that you love the way you want to write it.
I agree. Okay, so we have a question from Patricia. Thank you, Patricia. Can you describe a mistake you've made in world building, an object lesson you refer back to?
Oh, yes, actually, kind of, except it was a physics mistake. Which is world building.
No, it is absolutely.
It is.
Okay.
But so I'll be 100% honest. I try and avoid physics that I don't understand. And I hand wave other stuff, right? Which is why we have, basically hyperspace in the Roch books. I don't want to mess with any of the rest of it. And I just want to tell my big scale story. But there's the scene in the first ancillary book where Breck jumps off a bridge. And I had done some basic back of the napkin calculations. It was difficult to do anything very precise about terminal velocity and how things would work, and how fast she would be falling, so that I could, because I felt Breck would be very precise in her own mind about how all that was happening. And I wrote that scene, and sometime later, the book had come out, and I read a review, and the person said, okay, so this book is good, but this one scene, it's very clear that Leckie doesn't actually completely understand the physics of what's happening here. and describes, it was like one word in a sentence that made it clear that I did not have an intuitive grasp on that basic physics. And the reviewer was like, so ordinarily I'd put this down to lazy writing, but Leckie's not a lazy writer. Or Leckie's obviously not a lazy writer. And I was like, got me dead to rights. I messed up. And every now and then I think about that. And I'm like, I have to be more careful if I'm ever going to directly talk about the physics. And that's one of the reasons I don't usually talk about them up front. And I thought I was okay with falling objects, right? I thought I was going to be all right, but very clearly I messed it up. But I've always kept that in mind. But another object lesson that was sort of related is that was a place where I didn't make a mistake, but at least one reviewer was convinced that I had.
Yeah.
And that I was completely ignorant of science. And that was also an object lesson. And I have to admit, I remain angry at that person because I don't like being called ignorant. Notice the other reviewer complimented me while telling me that I was making my mistake. Didn't tell me, but you know what I mean?
Yeah.
But that was also an object lesson, which was that reviewers gonna review, right? And you can't worry too much about that.
When King's Dragon, which is the first of the Crown of Stars books, came out in the late 90s, someone said, well, the problem with this is that Elliott really clearly doesn't know anything about war because her armies are all too small. Well, the book is set in the Dark Ages, and they're assuming, they were like, the Roman legions had X numbers of whatever. And I'm like,
was the Romans.
I know. And I'm like, well, not my problem that you don't know anything about the Dark Ages, because I was right. But I want to add I have an object lesson that's quite horrifying. My Geron books, which I love, I decided to cleverly, because I had read, I don't know, All Quiet Flows the Dawn or something, and a Western with Cossacks. And I said, I'm going to make this science fiction setting, and they're going to kind of be cool, not quite steppe nomads, but not quite Cossack people, the people that the heroine falls in with, right? So I love the Geron series, but I stupidly did a kind of a fake Russian name thing.
Oh.
And I am embarrassed to this day because it was an easy fix. And someone who I dearly love, who is a native Russian speaker, said, "Oh, I really love those books." And I kind of went, I said, "But the names," and they said, I know, but I really love the book. So I can look past that. It was bad because I was young. And I didn't think that it mattered. So my choice would either have to been make up my own language or actually find someone who could help me and say, this is correct, this is not correct, which was easy because my cousin knew Russian.
Yeah.
But I didn't, and she had actually said something very kindly to me when the first book came out. And I was kind of like, right, well, and I regret that. I really regret it because Russian is a noble language and I just kind of, right?
Yeah.
So that was an important lesson for me to learn.
Yeah. Well, there's almost no amount of research is too much unless it's stopping you from writing. But if you're taking your work seriously, don't take yourself too seriously, but take your work very seriously and think about every detail. But in the end, when you've done that, then you just have to leave it to the universe. Yeah. Because somebody's going to come and find the one word in your sentence that tells you that you didn't understand falling objects. And somebody's going to come in and tell you that you didn't handle your horses properly. And somebody's going to come in and tell you that the thing that you specialize in, that you have a degree in, that you got all your details right, that you messed it up. It's going to happen. So do your absolute best. Don't just say, oh, well, nobody's going to care about my fake Russian names.
Yeah.
Because somebody's going to care about the fake Russian names. But once you've done your best, don't don't, you know, don't stay up all night about it and move on to the next project and do better the next time.
Yeah, I think that's excellent advice. We are at 2 p.m.
Oh my
amazingly.
goodness.
I know, right? This is the real reason I do this is totally selfish. Because it allows me during the pandemic to talk with people about writing, right?
Which we all miss. There's no BarCon anymore
Exactly.
until
Well, whenever, yeah.
whenever, yeah.
So that's so, Anne, I want to thank you for agreeing to be here this week, a month. God, never mind. I can't. I have no
in
brain.
this moment.
In this moment. There is, for those of you who are staying for the writing get together, that's Michael J. DeLuca is starting like any minute now. I want to thank SFWA as always for providing this, and the Nebula Conference for providing this platform, and Leckie for coming and chatting with me today.
Thank you.
And
this has been lovely.
it has been. And next month is either Karen Lord or Michelle Segarra, I think.
Oh, either's awesome.
But either, yeah. Well,
Oh.
and then the one who it isn't will be sometime after that. And I didn't look it up. So, but anyway, I want to thank everyone who has come to listen to this live today, and to all of you listening to us on the SFWA channel when this is put up there. Thank you. And we're done.
All right.
Okay.
Thank you so much.